It's becoming very clear that the role of government will be one of the major issues in next year's 2012 presidential election. And we hear it a lot from both sides of the political aisle, from the Democrats and the Republicans, and our data show that Americans are very concerned about the issues. But however, these attitudes are complex. Now, we've shown in our special series on government we've been running at Gallup.com that Americans are very negative with the way the nation is being governed. In fact, we have over 8 out of 10 Americans who say they are dissatisfied with the way the nation is being governed. We have record low percents of Americans who have confidence in the legislative branch of government, and we have Congress approval, which is at or near all-time lows. We also have Americans telling us that over 50 cents out of the dollar, every tax dollar they send here to Washington is being wasted. And we have other data along the same line. So Americans are clearly negative on government. Now, we also know that Americans feel that the government has too much power. This does not constitute a huge majority, but over half of Americans say that the government has too much power. Americans say, as they have for a long time now, that the government's doing too much that should be left to businesses. And Americans say that there is too much regulation of business. So that's another whole component of this. All of this might suggest that Americans would tell us that they think a government should do very little, that is, pull back and not get involved at all in Americans' lives. But that's where the complexity comes in. Because as you see in front of you there, when we give Americans a 5-point scale, where one end of it represents a pure libertarian position, that is, the government should do very little, only provide basic functions, and where the other end of the scale represents a much more activist position, where the government should take active steps to try to get involved and make Americans' lives better in every way it can, where do Americans place themselves? Well, it's split. We got a little more than a third of Americans who are on that libertarian end, but we have about the same number who are on that very activist end, and a little more than a quarter of Americans who are right in the middle. So we do not find that a huge majority of Americans adopt a libertarian position that says government shouldn't be involved at all. Americans clearly, at least a significant percent of them, say that government has a role to play. It should be doing things. So it looks like to us there are a couple of sentiments coming up for the American people that elected representatives here in Washington should pay attention to. One is get more efficient. We think a lot of the disdain that Americans have for what's happening in Washington is that Americans think there's too much bickering, too much partisanship, and, as we just talked about a minute ago, that too many tax dollars are being wasted here. So some of this is a process concern, Americans telling us that they think the government just needs to be more efficient. Second, clearly, Americans say government should pick what it does and not try to do everything. And of course, that's the problem. Exactly where that comes in is what government officials are going to have to decide, but Americans are saying don't do nothing, but on the other hand, don't assume that government should do everything. Put yourself somewhere in the middle. That's the sentiment we're getting from the American people. Finally, one other point, the economy is terrible according to Americans. Consumer confidence is very low, and I think that's part of the reason we're getting all this negativity. Americans are just frustrated in general. So when we pollsters call people up and ask about government, they say negative things because in general, Americans perceive that things aren't going well in the U.S. at this time. If the economy turns around, perceptions of government probably will in fact get better. That's an update for you from our Gallup series on the role of government. I'm Dr. Frank Newport, Gallup Editor-in-Chief.